Hello everyone! I ended up really enjoying making the end of year list video for games that I loved last year, so I figured I'd do it again. So welcome one and all to the second, probably annual list of my favorite games, this time for 2024. This was a pretty weird year for games in general. It was a year that largely lacked huge installments in major franchises, instead being chock full of games that kinda just came out of nowhere and blew me away. Not necessarily games that were shadow dropped or anything like that, but ones that prior to their releases I didn't have a ton of excitement for, but ended up being amazing experiences that made a huge impact on me. Much like last year, this list is going to be largely in no particular order. These are all games that I absolutely adore, and most of them are so close together in my own personal rankings that I wouldn't feel right in trying to objectively order them. That being said, I am going to be separating one game from the rabble this time around, a game that towers so far above the rest that I feel like it deserves a special spot on top as my game of the year. And of course, just like last year, if a game that you love isn't mentioned here, it's very likely that I just didn't play it. This has been a very long year for me, and I just didn't get nearly as much personal time to just play games I was interested in this year. So I know there are quite a few great titles that I just haven't gotten around to trying yet. With that out of the way, let's get into it. Now, just before we get started, if you like what I do, maybe subscribe to the channel, and if you really want to go above and beyond, you can join my Patreon. You'll see my main videos a week early, get exclusive updates on future projects, and even get the occasional exclusive video. So with that out of the way, let's get to the games. So before we start listing the best of the best this year, I wanted to go over a few honorable mentions. First up is going to be Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. I loved Remake and was super excited to play Rebirth when it first launched, but I kinda just never had a chance to. I put like 5 to 10 hours into it earlier in the year, but when other things started popping up, they tended to take priority, and I was never able to give it the time it deserved. But from what I did play, I was very much enjoying it, and if its gameplay improvements are anything to go by, Rebirth will definitely end up being far better than Remake in my eyes. I just need to actually get around to playing it. Maybe when the PC port drops. Second is Mario & Luigi Brothership. Now this may seem strange to those who have seen my review of it because I am very positive towards it, but man, it does have a lot of issues, and I really think that they do put it ever so slightly out of the best for the year. The games that I love this year the most are just so good that while Brothership is great, it just doesn't quite compare to them. Lastly is Elden Ring Shadow of the Erdtree. The base game is probably my game of the year in 2022. I don't know, that goes back and forth between this and Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but regardless, I adore it. Of course, I was basically guaranteed to love this expansion, and yeah, I do. That being said, I don't think it's the strongest expansion From has ever put out. It's clearly the largest and has the most content, but the density and quality of that content isn't quite there compared to the base game, and even to other expansions, the Old Hunters in particular. Regardless, it is still great, just not good enough to quite reach the pinnacle. Anyways, now that those are out of the way, let's get to the actual good stuff. First up on the list today is Local Thunk's card-based roguelite, Batro. So I think this game is my newest roguelite addiction. I was never a big poker fan or really a fan of any of the games that use the standard deck of cards, so when Batro was announced, I wasn't even planning on buying it. I mean, it looked pretty cool, the visual style was nice and all, but from the trailer, it didn't seem like it would be that compelling to me. But once it started getting rave reviews, I decided to give it a shot, and man, it hooked me instantly. It seems so simple at a glance. You have your deck of cards and you play poker hands to get points in order to pass certain score barriers to eventually beat the game. But it's hiding a nearly limitless amount of both breadth and depth just beneath the surface, and as soon as you figure out even a little bit of it, it just becomes a rabbit hole that you can't escape from. How each deck is set up supports different builds, the jokers you get, all of which have amazing designs by the way, vastly change how you play, the different card modifiers and special cards that you come across alter builds even more. All the different stakes increase difficulty in incredibly smart ways that make the game harder, but in ways that never feel frustrating or punishing. It's super well designed from top to bottom, and it's absolutely mastered the dopamine rush when you come across something particularly strong. The first time you break the score barrier into scientific notation is euphoric. This is a game that I definitely see myself playing for a very long time. Other games may come and go, but Jimbo is eternal. I am not a Warhammer guy. I know basically nothing about the series, and my only other meaningful experience with the franchise at all was playing a couple hours of Vermintide a decade ago. So obviously this game wasn't even on my radar for the majority of the year. From what I had heard from friends in the know, it looked good, but that still didn't really mean anything to me. But I built a new PC earlier this year, and coincidentally, one of the free goodies I got with my new CPU was a free code for Space Marine 2, and since I had two other friends who were planning on playing it anyways, I figured I may as well give it a shot. So I played through the campaign with them, and it was awesome from start to finish. Obviously, I basically had no idea what was going on ever. I knew none of the characters, had no context for any of the game's main crises or plot points, but it just pulled off the Horde mode gameplay so well that it didn't really matter. The gunplay was good, the melee combat was great, and even playing on the harder difficulty, it was balanced really well. We were struggling basically the entire time, but it was never so overwhelming that we would choose to change it. It's got a good amount of variety too. There's a bunch of different weapons to swap builds around, there's different secondary abilities that change how you play. It's just a load of fun. Now I know that the game has a lot more to it than what I played as well. It's set up like a lot of live service style games are nowadays, where loads of weapons, skins and such are locked behind a million hours of playtime in optional multiplayer missions and the like, and in another life, if I were more willing to sink that much time into a single multiplayer game, I would probably have a blast with it. The core gameplay is so much fun, and especially with friends, it's a great time, but man, I just don't have time for that. As a fan of the Persona series, Persona 3 has always had a special place in my heart. It was the first of the more modern Persona games, establishing a lot of what the series would end up being known for. But because it was the first, it was also pretty awkward in a few ways. Of the three modern Persona games, 3 clearly took the most risks, and even compared to its successors, many of the things it did with its story, characters, and gameplay stand out quite a bit from the crowd. But on the other hand, being the first, it was also by far the most limited and basic in many ways as well. In that sense, it was very ready for a full remake, and I played this remake as soon as it was released. As a remake of Persona 3, it's definitely not perfect. Quite a bit of content from the various versions of Persona 3 were unfortunately left on the cutting room floor. I was particularly disappointed to see Persona 3 Portable's female protagonist be left out, but ignoring that theoretical version that took the best aspects from all previous releases, as a recreation of the original Persona 3 being brought to modern audiences, it is fantastic. The gameplay has finally been brought up to modern standards, which was really the only thing keeping me from replaying 3 more often. The lack of full party control in FES is kind of a deal breaker nowadays. Beyond the gameplay being way better, the game looks amazing with a few asterisks and such, and it sounds great too. The new voice actors do a great job with their characters, and many of the new tracks made for the soundtrack are amazing. Color Unite in particular has quickly risen up the ranks to be a top 5 Persona song of all time for me. There are things to nitpick about it, to be sure, but as much as I am the type to nitpick, I just didn't really feel the need to this time around. Even at its worst, it's still nowhere near bad enough to actively complain about it, and hey, it's Persona 3. There's very little out there like it, and I'm so glad that more people have the chance to experience it now. Now, this is a weird one because I had seen the trailer for it back in 2023 and was immediately sold on it, but I quickly forgot about it until it released back in August. As soon as I saw that it had though, I bought it and played through it and loved every second of it. This is a comedy game where you play as a little fella and you kind of just go around unintentionally solving people's problems in a very British town. There really isn't much in terms of actual gameplay to speak of here. You get to control your little fella and you smack stuff. That's pretty much all there is to it, but where it excels is in its humor, and oh boy does it excel. Now, I'm not sure how the comedy reads to someone from Northern England, as I'm sure there are loads of gags that act more like in-jokes that someone from elsewhere wouldn't understand, but as one of those someones from elsewhere, I'm just utterly charmed by the whole aesthetic and atmosphere. The town is quaint and its people are quirky, and the situations you get yourself into are just so absurd and silly that I couldn't wait to see what would happen next. And thankfully, it basically never steps on the brakes either. The game is only like 2 hours long, which many people could see as a negative, but I don't know, I see it as being all killer, no filler, and I appreciate it not wanting to overstay its welcome here. Definitely try it out if you love a good comedy game. I really don't have to talk much about this one, right? I've said my piece on why I love the Thousand-Year Door multiple times at this point, and there really isn't much more I can say. This game is really special to me. It's a game that even 20 years after its original release basically hasn't tarnished at all, and the remake just made an already amazing game even better. If you like Mario RPGs or RPGs in general, you really owe it to yourself to at least give it a shot. It really is one of the best games I've ever played. As a fan of the Prince of Persia games, I was a little iffy on the Lost Crown when it was announced. Not really for anything that the game was doing wrong, they just put their worst foot forward with that original trailer, and unfortunately for the game, it never quite recovered and ended up not being a huge success. That's a shame because while it's not the Prince of Persia most people were hoping for, at this point we are kinda just waiting to see if Ubisoft will survive long enough to release that Sands of Time remake, the Lost Crown has quickly risen in the ranks to being one of my favorite games in the series. As a Metroidvania, it plays with a lot of the same tropes and ideas, a big interconnected map, progressive upgrades that open more and more of that map with each new discovery, loads of fun collectibles, that sort of thing. While I probably wouldn't go so far as to say that it's the best in any of those things, it does them all really well, and it has one thing that really sets it apart in a positive way. The combat in the Lost Crown is some of the deepest, most challenging, and most fun systems I've ever played in a Metroidvania. It's got fighting game style depth to it, loads of ways to build Sargon up, and it's a ton of fun to master. And the bosses! This game seriously has some of my favorite bosses from any Metroidvania, period. The endgame bosses are spectacle fights that are intensely challenging and immaculately designed. It's really great, and I wish that I had found time earlier in the year to make a full video on it. Definitely give it a shot if you're sick of waiting for Silksong to never release. I love 3D platformers and the few studios that still make them, but it's been increasingly frustrating to see Nintendo be so firmly at the top of the genre with basically no competition. I love their games and adore every 3D Mario that isn't named Super Mario 3D World, but outside of Nintendo, what good high-profile 3D platformers have there been in the last decade? A Hat in Time is the only one that really comes to mind for me. Sony's 3D platformer drought has been particularly unfortunate since it has a bunch of franchises that could easily rival the big N's. That being said, when I got my PS5, I played Astro's Playroom immediately and really liked what it was doing. It played well, looked good, and had a bunch of fun ideas that could easily be expanded on in a full game. I had hoped that it would happen, but also was not really betting on it, since it seemed like Astro would stay as a tech demo series like it was for the PS5 and PSVR. So when Astrobot got announced this year, I was pretty blindsided, and I was so excited to see what Team Asobi could do with the genre. And man, it did not disappoint. It took everything I loved from Astro's Playroom and turned it up way beyond 11. The game is huge, there's so many different worlds, so many different mechanics, new power-ups, and everything is incredibly fun. It's an awesome celebration of PlayStation as a whole too, with hundreds of different characters represented with their own little Astro bots, along with several levels being straight up references to some of Sony's biggest games. If I were to criticize anything, I do kind of think that the game so blatantly referencing the console it's on and the controller you use to play it with is a little gauche, and will make the game a little less timeless than it could have been otherwise. At least when Nintendo does this sort of thing, they typically pretend their obvious stand-in for their system is something else, but that's so minor and frankly doesn't really matter all that much. It's an amazing game, easily the best thing Sony has put out on the PS5 this past year, and probably ever. It seriously might be their game of the generation, it really is that good. If you had asked me last year if I wanted to play an Indiana Jones game, I would have said, maybe. If you had asked me if I wanted to play a first-person Indiana Jones game, I would have said hell no. I honestly didn't think it could work. The platforming, puzzles, and exploration work so well in a third-person perspective in games like Uncharted that I figured a change to first-person would ruin that. Machine Games, which developed this one, was pretty adamant on keeping it first-person though, so they had a lot of work to do in order to make sure that a game like this would work at all in that perspective, and honestly, I think they pulled it off with flying colors, and they did it by mixing a lot of what I love about the Uncharted series with a lot of what I love about the immersive sim genre. Before we get into that though, I just want to talk about how well this game manages to capture the feel of the Indiana Jones series. Troy Baker does a great impression of young Harrison Ford, and his performance really drives the whole game. The story feels like a great indie movie, with fun twists and turns, swashbuckling through ancient ruins, a great cast of characters, and the slightly supernatural bend that you'd expect from Indiana Jones. They did a great job here, and I wholly trust them to do more with this franchise in the future, especially because the gameplay is just so good. First and foremost, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is effectively an immersive sim. Indiana himself doesn't really have any superpowers like in Dishonored or Deus Ex, but he still has quite a bit at his disposal. He gets a bunch of disguises to blend in areas that he'd normally get beat up in, he has his trusty whip to distract people or to grab onto things, and I really love how they handled combat here. Like I said, Indy is just a guy, so he can't really handle an army of dudes on his own. He has to be creative, and stealth combat is all about being resourceful. Finding weapons to beat people up with is relatively easy, but they break really quickly, so you can't just use one thing forever. And if you manage to find yourself in a fight without a weapon, you're limited to good old fisticuffs. And the level design here is great too. It pulls heavily from the immersive sim genre here as well. There's loads of ways to approach any one situation. You can go in guns blazing, you can try to blend in with the disguises, you can sneak around to find alternative routes, and more. It gives you a ton of options, and I love that. The puzzles are great too, all being varied and interesting, and fitting into the larger mystery as a whole really well most of the time. This is the stuff from the Uncharted games that I love the most, exploring ancient ruins and uncovering secrets that nobody has seen for thousands of years, and they do an amazing job with it here. This really is a great experience, one that I was very pleasantly surprised by, but it didn't do quite enough to have it hit the top spot. And here we are, what I consider to be the best game I played all year, Metaphor ReFantazio. Atlas started off the year pretty strong with Persona 3 Reload, but ended it on a completely different level. I honestly think that this may very well be the best game I've ever played from Atlas, period. And again, this is another game that prior to launch I had very little knowledge of. Thankfully they put out a demo before it released, and upon trying that out, I was immediately sold on what it was trying to do. Metaphor is in a lot of ways a spiritual successor to the Persona games. It has a lot of what you'd expect from them: time management, social links, dungeon crawling, the whole shebang, but Metaphor takes these pieces and molds them into something that feels entirely new. Rather than just living your high school life while waiting for stuff to happen, the stakes are incredibly high right off the bat. You are fighting for the chance to become king, and you'll need to travel the land to get people on your side. The story the game tells is so incredibly compelling from start to finish. I was basically at the edge of my seat for the entire 60-hour journey. The main plot is so well done and tackles a lot of really important themes in very smart, nuanced ways. The cast of characters is the strongest I've seen in an RPG in decades, and the world built here is so deep, so thorough, and so rich. And its main villain is probably the best I've seen in an Atlas RPG as well. It's seriously one of my favorite stories ever told in an RPG. It's so well done. The gameplay here is equally good. It takes everything from Persona and basically fixes anything wrong with it. The time management is more interesting since you're going to be physically traveling around the world, which takes time, meaning you'll need to plan out what you're doing more deliberately. The social link system is simplified in a very smart way. You're no longer punished for not choosing the best dialogue without the best persona equipped. You still get rewards for choosing the best dialogue options, but the time between ranks isn't artificially lengthened if you don't look up the right choices. And the battle system is so much more fun than anything from the Persona games. It takes a different approach where instead of each party member having one turn and the option for extra actions by landing effective hits, there's now a series of turn icons that goes down one by one after each action, or by half of one by landing effective hits or passing your turn. It changes turns into a universal resource that you have to manage to get the best results from, and on top of the new job system that's been implemented, this radically changes the feel of the battle system into something that feels entirely new, and it's so good. The strategic depth is immense here, and it feels so so great when plans go right. Now, it's not perfect. There are a few things that come across as big weaknesses. You can't swap out jobs at all during battle, so if you, say, go into a boss fight without anything to hit a boss's weakness, or are weak to that boss's attacks yourself, there's just no remedy for that, and chances are you're just gonna have to wipe and reload a save. That kinda sucks, but ultimately it is a small thing, and the game even does try to help you out by selling hints as to what certain bosses will do and what they'll be weak to. Anyways, yeah, Metaphor ReFantasio is easily the best game I've played this year, and it may just end up as one of my favorite games of all time, honestly. It's so good at pretty much everything it does, and it'll be a really tough act to follow for Persona 6 whenever that ends up happening. And there we go, those were my picks for the best games I've played this year. This was a bit of a weird year, but a good one if I do say so myself. What were your favorites from 2024? Were any of my picks off base? Let me know what you think. There's always so many games to play, and I'll never have enough time to get to them all, but I'd love to see anything particularly cool be brought to my attention. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you all in 2025. And just before I end the video here, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Louis G, Nick Ulrich, Adora Shark, James Fish, Drawing and Stuff Artist, Ryan Powell, Lucky Wonderfish, Creeping Briar, Matthew Lorigan, Dom, Benjamin Iliff, Parker P. Allen, Villager Films, Ashad Maya, and Anthony. You're all the best. Thank you so much.